Tonight, we begin with a diplomatic development that world leaders, NATO officials, and international observers had feared, anticipated, and carefully prepared for all at once. A phone call that unfolded not over weeks of careful diplomatic negotiation, not through months of back-channel communications, but in a single conversation between two leaders who understand the weight of words. A single conversation that may have shifted the trajectory of the largest ground war in Europe since World War IOD. A single conversation that brought the word ceasefire back into the international vocabulary. A single conversation that for a brief moment made millions of people on both sides of this conflict believe that peace might finally be within reach. What President Volodymyr Zelensky announced today crossed a threshold that Vladimir Putin had calculated would never come, at least not on these terms. And when that announcement was made, when that line was finally crossed, the Kremlin did not hesitate. They responded with rejection, defiance, and what many observers are calling a dangerous doubling down on their original war aims. But here's what makes tonight different from every other night in this three-year conflict. For the first time, the terms of negotiation are being dictated not from Moscow, not entirely from Kiev, but from Washington. And that changes everything. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements from the State Department, not formal communiques from the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, just signals that the Trump administration was preparing something unprecedented in the context of this war. President Trump has been vocal about ending this conflict, yes, but he has been strategic in his vocal opposition to what he calls endless wars. His moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a predictability. But what set off alarm bells in Brussels, in Kiev, and in the corridors of NATO headquarters this week was that the pattern went silent. The usual Twitter posts stopped. The media appearances became carefully scripted. The off-the-cuff remarks about making a deal disappeared. Intelligence analysts who monitor diplomatic channels know the indicators: the sudden increase in encrypted communications between Washington and Kiev, the unusual movements of senior diplomatic staff, the quiet cancellation of previously scheduled NATO meetings, the sudden reshuffling of presidential schedules on both sides. All of that went into overdrive. And whenever the Trump administration goes quiet on a foreign policy issue, it means something dramatic is about to become very, very public. For months, the conventional wisdom in European capitals was that any peace negotiation would have to wait. Wait for the spring offensive. Wait for the winter to pass. Wait for the political situation in Russia to clarify. Wait for the American election cycle to complete. But waiting, as we have learned repeatedly in this conflict, is a luxury that Ukrainians cannot afford. Every day of this war costs lives. Every week costs infrastructure that will take decades to rebuild. Every month costs a generation of young Ukrainians who should be building families, not defending trenches. President Zelensky understood this, and when the call came from President Trump, he was ready. Early this morning, Eastern European time, the Ukrainian presidential office released what they described as a significant diplomatic communication, including details of a phone call that had not been publicly scheduled, had not been announced in advance, and had not appeared on any official calendar. These are the kinds of diplomatic maneuvers that world leaders only employ when they are signaling something very specific. A breakthrough is imminent, a crisis requires immediate attention, or a fundamental shift in strategy is underway. International observers didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that both Washington and Kyiv were changing their posture simultaneously. And when two allied governments shift strategy without explanation, even by the smallest measure, Moscow pays very close attention. The details that emerged over the following hours painted a picture of a conversation that was, by all accounts, substantive, direct, and at times confrontational. President Trump reportedly opened the conversation by reiterating his position that the war must end quickly and decisively. President Zelensky reportedly responded by outlining Ukraine's minimum requirements for any cessation of hostilities: full territorial recognition, security guarantees from Western powers, NASA, accountability mechanisms for war crimes, NASA, a path to European Union and NATO membership. These are not new demands. But what was new was President Zelensky's willingness to discuss them in the context of an immediate ceasefire, rather than as preconditions for negotiation. This was the shift that caught everyone's attention. For 3 years, Ukraine's position had been clear: negotiate from strength, not weakness. For 3 years, President Zelensky had insisted that any ceasefire without security guarantees would simply give Russia time to rearm and regroup. For 3 years, the message from Kyiv was unwavering. Today, that message evolved, not abandoned, evolved, and evolution in the language of diplomacy often means compromise is finally possible. The statement issued by the Kremlin tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not the kind of carefully worded diplomatic language we typically see from the Russian Foreign Ministry. It was a rejection. Kremlin spokesperson after senior official described President Zelensky's announcement as a propaganda exercise designed for Western audiences, a distraction from Ukraine's military failures on the ground, and perhaps most importantly, irrelevant, because the terms being proposed do not reflect the reality of the situation. But rejection only works as a strategy if the other side accepts it and moves on. Ukraine did not. The United States did not. In fact, the response from Washington today was among the sharpest we've seen since the Trump administration took office. Here's what we know. Within hours of the Kremlin's rejection, Secretary of State Marco Rubio issued a statement calling Russia's position a strategic miscalculation that will have consequences. This wasn't the usual diplomatic boilerplate. This wasn't the measured, both sides language we've become accustomed to hearing. This was a direct message, the kind of statement that governments only issue when they are preparing to escalate, not de-escalate. Simultaneously, Pentagon officials confirmed that military aid packages to Ukraine would continue without interruption. There had been speculation in recent weeks that the Trump administration might use military aid as leverage in peace negotiations. That speculation ended today. The message was clear: America supports Ukraine's right to defend itself, regardless of what happens at the negotiating table. Tonight, multiple sources confirmed that the Trump-Zelensky conversation covered significantly more ground than has been publicly acknowledged. According to officials familiar with the discussion, the two leaders addressed the immediate ceasefire proposal, including specific geographic boundaries and monitoring mechanisms. The question of occupied territories, including whether frozen conflict lines could serve as de facto borders pending future negotiations. The role of NATO, including what security guarantees short of full membership might look like. And critically, the question of Russian sanctions: what would be lifted, when, and under what conditions. This last point is believed to have been the most contentious. President Trump has long suggested that sanctions relief could be part of a broader peace deal. President Zelensky has consistently opposed any sanctions relief without complete Russian withdrawal from Ukrainian territory. Finding middle ground on this issue has been the central challenge of every peace proposal for the past 3 years. But sources suggest that today's conversation included a new element: phased sanctions relief tied to verifiable Russian compliance with ceasefire terms. This would represent a significant shift from both the American and Ukrainian positions. It would also represent exactly the kind of compromise that might actually bring Russia to the table if Russia were interested in coming to the table at all. Which brings us to President Putin's response. The Kremlin's rejection today was not just rhetorical. It was accompanied by several concrete actions. Russian forces launched a new offensive in the Donetsk region, targeting positions that had been relatively quiet for weeks. The Russian Ministry of Defense announced an expansion of military exercises near the Ukrainian border. And most significantly, the Kremlin announced that any future negotiations would need to be based on the territorial realities on the ground, diplomatic language for accepting Russian control of occupied territories as the starting point for any discussion. This is the position Ukraine cannot accept. This is the position the United States has consistently rejected. And this is the position that makes tonight's developments so significant, because for the first time, Putin is being forced to publicly reject a peace proposal that has American support. He can no longer hide behind claims that the West is the obstacle to peace. He can no longer pretend that Ukraine is the unreasonable party. The offer is on the table. The terms are clear. And the world is watching to see who will blink first. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Intelligence analysts now believe that President Putin's immediate rejection was designed to test the cohesion of the American-Ukrainian alliance after weeks of speculation about divisions within the Trump administration. Putin wanted to see whether the United States would pressure Zelensky to make further concessions. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't waver. They issued a joint statement with Kiev that was so unified, so coordinated, that even Russian state media noticed the change in tone. You don't get Moscow's attention easily, but today, the Western alliance did. Senior diplomats speaking with international media under condition of anonymity described Putin's rejection as posturing, a way to establish a negotiating position before serious talks begin. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both committed to peace and prepared for continued conflict. Their diplomatic response was not only swift, it was calibrated so precisely that it addressed every major Russian talking point within hours of the Kremlin statement. That coordination matters because it shows that Kiev and Washington are operating from the same playbook. It shows that Ukraine is not a passive recipient of American policy. They are an active partner in shaping it. And it shows that President Zelensky, whatever his critics may say, understands the diplomatic game as well as anyone in the world today. For 3 years, he has managed the nearly impossible task of keeping Western support unified while fighting a war against a nuclear power. For 3 years, he has balanced the demands of his own population who want the war to end with the realities of what peace without security would actually mean. And for 3 years, he has resisted the temptation to accept a bad deal simply because a bad deal would stop the immediate killing. Tonight, he took a risk. He put a genuine offer on the table, and Putin rejected it. That rejection may turn out to be one of the most significant strategic mistakes of this entire conflict. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of the diplomatic effort that led to this moment. European leaders carried out a coordinated communications campaign with statements from France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Poland all released within hours of each other, all expressing support for Ukraine's willingness to negotiate. NATO Secretary General issued a statement describing the ceasefire proposal as a serious and credible basis for discussion, language that has not been used about any previous peace proposal. And the United Nations Security Council has scheduled an emergency session to discuss the developments, with both the American and Ukrainian ambassadors expected to address the body. This wasn't just a phone call. This wasn't just a diplomatic overture. This was a coordinated international effort. This was a demonstration of Western unity. And Western unity is the one thing Putin has struggled to undermine since this war began. For every diplomatic success Russia has achieved, and there have been some Ukraine, and its allies have countered with something that reminded the world why this war matters. The sanctions have held longer than anyone predicted. The military aid has continued despite political transitions in multiple Western capitals. The humanitarian support has remained robust despite compassion fatigue. And tonight, that unity is stronger than ever. Remember, Putin thought this war would be over in days. He thought Kyiv would fall within the first week. He thought the Ukrainian government would collapse and be replaced by a Russian puppet. He thought the West would issue some strongly worded statements and then move on. He thought that by the time summer came, Ukraine would be a memory, and the world would have accepted the new reality. But tonight, the exact opposite is the case. Ukraine is still fighting. Ukraine is still receiving Western support. Ukraine is still, despite everything, a sovereign nation with a democratically elected government that speaks for its people. And Putin is the one facing pressure from his own military, from his own economy, from his own population, and now from a peace proposal that exposes him as the obstacle to ending this conflict. History will record this moment. History will record that when given the chance to end the war on reasonable terms, Russia said no, and history will remember who made that decision. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's rejection happened at a time when the Russian leader is under extraordinary internal pressure. The hardliners in the Russian military want total victory, the complete conquest of Ukraine, and the destruction of its government. The pragmatists in the Russian business community want the sanctions lifted and normal economic relations with the West restored. The nationalists in Russian politics want territorial gains that justify the enormous costs of this war. And the Russian population, exhausted, grieving, and increasingly skeptical, wants the killing to stop. Putin is balancing these demands while fighting a war that has lasted far longer, cost far more, and achieved far less than he ever imagined. And when leaders in that position make sudden decisions, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because the alternative appearing weak is even more dangerous to their survival. Putin rejected this ceasefire proposal because accepting it would require admitting that 3 years of war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, and international pariah status have not achieved Russia's goals. He cannot make that admission, not politically, not personally, and certainly not publicly. So he rejected the proposal. But in rejecting it, he may have made his position weaker, not stronger. The State Department's statement, now circulating through every diplomatic channel in the world, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russia to dictate the terms of peace. Officials said plainly that Russia's rejection was inconsistent with Moscow's stated desire for diplomatic resolution. That is State Department language for Putin is lying when he says he wants peace. You don't usually hear that kind of directness from American diplomats unless something serious is at stake. But tonight, American officials are done with diplomatic niceties. They are done pretending that Russia is a good faith negotiating partner. They are done suggesting that both sides share equal responsibility for the continuation of this war. The message from Washington is clear. Ukraine offered peace. Russia rejected it. And the world should draw its own conclusions about who actually wants this war to continue. Meanwhile, President Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a somber, determined speech tonight. He said, "We extended our hand for peace. It was slapped away, but we will extend it again because that is who we are," he said. Putin believes that rejection makes him appear strong, but the world sees the truth. The world sees weakness disguised as strength. And he said, "To my fellow Ukrainians, we will continue to fight. We will continue to defend our land, and we will continue to seek peace, because these things are not contradictions. They are the essence of who we are as a people." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a wartime leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that his people are tired. He knows that 3 years of war have taken an unimaginable toll. He knows that every day brings more death, more destruction, more grief. But he also knows that peace without security is just a pause before the next war. And he is not willing to trade his country's future for temporary relief. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's rejection wasn't isolated, along with Putin's formal dismissal of the ceasefire terms. Belarus also announced new military exercises along the Ukrainian border, exercises that intelligence officials believe are designed to tie down Ukrainian forces in the north. Russian cyber operations increased attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, including attempted disruptions of the power grid, and Russian state media launched a coordinated propaganda campaign describing the ceasefire proposal as a Western trick designed to give Ukraine time to rearm. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means that the rejection wasn't just a diplomatic response. It was the beginning of a new phase, a phase that may involve military escalation, a phase that may test Western resolve in new ways, a phase that everyone hoped could be avoided, but that now appears increasingly inevitable. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing a major military offensive using the rejection of peace talks as justification for escalation. Another is that Putin is attempting to wait out the political situation in the West, gambling that divisions within NATO will eventually undermine support for Ukraine. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to provoke a response that would allow him to claim victimhood and rally domestic support for continued war. But today, President Zelensky took that option off the table. He didn't respond with anger. He didn't threaten escalation. He didn't give Putin any propaganda victories. He responded with dignity, with determination, and with an unwavering commitment to both defense and diplomacy. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Putin wants to see whether Western unity can outlast Russian stubbornness. Zelensky wants to show that Ukraine will remain standing no matter how long this takes. The United States wants to prevent this conflict from expanding into a broader European war. And Europe wants to prevent a Russian victory that would embolden autocrats everywhere. These goals are not in conflict with each other, but achieving all of them simultaneously requires patience, resources, and political will. And all three of those things are finite. The question is not whether the West can outlast Russia. The question is whether the West is willing to pay the price of doing so. Tonight's developments suggest that the answer, at least for now, is yes. Tonight, we've heard from diplomatic sources who are now monitoring developments in real time. They say that back-channel communications between Washington and Moscow remain open despite the public rejection. They say that European leaders are preparing a unified response that may include new sanctions on Russian officials involved in rejecting the peace proposal. And they say that Putin's decision to reject the ceasefire is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test the new American administration's commitment to Ukraine. But the Trump administration is not wavering. In fact, the administration is doing exactly what Putin hoped they wouldn't do, standing firm with Kyiv, while keeping the door open for future negotiations. The response today, swift, unified, and strategic, sent a message to Moscow that the change in American administrations does not mean a change in American commitment. And it sent a message to the world that the Western alliance remains intact, capable, and ready for whatever comes next. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with his rejection. But what we do know is that President Zelensky's announcement was historic. It demonstrated Ukrainian willingness to negotiate in good faith. It exposed Russian intransigence for the world to see. And it reminded everyone that the responsibility for continuing this war rests squarely on Vladimir Putin's shoulders. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the coming days and weeks. If they return to the negotiating table with serious proposals, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of the end. If they continue to reject every diplomatic overture, Ukraine and its allies have already shown they are prepared for a long war. They have shown they are ready to defend. They have shown they are ready to endure. They have shown they are ready for whatever Putin decides to do. And tonight, for the first time in months, Vladimir Putin appears to be on the defensive. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet, and when Putin is quiet, it means he is calculating. It means he is weighing his options. It means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times before, but seems to keep forgetting. Ukraine will not surrender. The West will not abandon its allies. And the world will not forget what happened here. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Peace was offered. Peace was rejected, and the man who rejected it will answer to history. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase of this historic conflict unfolds. What you have witnessed tonight is not the end of this story. It is perhaps the end of a chapter, but the book remains unwritten. The Trump-Zelensky phone call and Putin's subsequent rejection will be analyzed, debated, and studied for years to come. Historians will ask whether this was a genuine turning point or merely another moment of false hope in a conflict that has produced so many. They will ask whether Putin's rejection was a strategic miscalculation or a rational response to domestic political pressures. They will ask whether the Western alliance could have done more, pressed harder, offered different terms. But those are questions for the future. For now, the reality is what it is. War continues. Peace remains elusive. And the people of Ukraine's civilians and soldiers alike continue to pay the price for one man's imperial ambitions. As you go about your day tomorrow, as you read the next round of headlines, as you watch the next development unfold, remember this: every day this war continues is a day that didn't have to happen. Every casualty is someone who should still be alive. Every destroyed building is someone's home, someone's business, someone's life's work. And every diplomatic failure is a reminder that ending wars is infinitely harder than starting them. President Zelensky showed courage today. He showed a willingness to take political risks for the sake of peace. He showed that Ukraine, despite everything it has endured, remains committed to a diplomatic solution. President Putin, in contrast, showed exactly what he has shown since the very beginning of this conflict: contempt for international law, contempt for human life, and contempt for any outcome that does not fulfill his vision of Russian dominance. The world has been reminded once again of who is responsible for this war. The world has been reminded once again of who is blocking the path to peace. And the world, one hopes, will remember